best examples of what's working somewhere to lower greenhouse gas emissions and improve people's lives are globally in cities.
Correct me if I'm mistaken, cities are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally?
Yes, that's correct. Studies show that about 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from cities or from the activities needed to sustain them, like a power plant. Added to that, though, is that over about the last decade or so, the world has predominantly become urban. And the majority of economic activities are in cities as well. So the people are in cities, our economies in cities, and our greenhouse gas emissions in cities. That means that where there are solutions, there is a huge opportunity to address climate change.
Now, as the former mayor of Toronto, you obviously know about the challenges that cities face, but you argue that they still have a lot of power despite their financial or jurisdictional constraints. Tell me how that works.
Cities have accepted the science and said that we're going to try to build a 1.5 degree world. And the first thing that cities have, particularly through the office of the mayor, is a tremendous bully pulpit to fight for action on climate change. The second thing they have is a lot of powers that actually are really relevant to climate change. They oversee transportation, the quality of buildings, where new buildings go, how buildings are built. They oversee waste management. Often they have influence on or control over electricity. And really those are the four areas we're talking about: how we generate our electricity, how we heat and cool our buildings, our transportation systems, and our waste management. And in each of those, there are really significant advances that cities have made globally, whether they have direct regulatory authority or not, to lower greenhouse gas emissions, build better cities, and really move the world along the right trajectory.
What cities do you think are currently leading the way in the different sectors that you mentioned?
I can give some really good examples. In buildings, for example, we need to build new buildings much better. And today we can build buildings that are basically zero emission. And Vancouver has a building code that's going to require that by 2030. So they probably have the world's leading building code. And they're using it also to create a whole range of local industries that supply the parts for this new kind of way of building buildings, like mass timber, like different kinds of windows and so forth. New York City has mandated that existing commercial buildings over a certain size, which are the ones that emit the most greenhouse gases, actually have to cut in half by 2030 the greenhouse gas emissions. And in a city like New York, buildings are the biggest sector of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are examples in other sectors as well. In transportation, Shenzhen, China is incredible. Its taxi fleet and its bus fleet are entirely electric, and they've used the fact of public transport going electric to create a whole new industry. The world's leading electric bus manufacturers in Shenzhen, China. In Canada, we're starting to look at electric buses. China is way ahead of us. They're already there. And if you combine that with clean electricity grids, which we have in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, in Canada, you have huge advances in lowering greenhouse gas emissions.
Now, I understand that you think that the city you used to lead has done well across the board on reducing emissions.
Well, it's not just I think. The facts show that. The climate plan that we brought in while I was in office, which was called Changes in the Air in 2007, incorporated a whole variety of actions: building new public transport, decarbonizing buildings in the public and private sector, working in neighborhoods and communities with people on smaller projects and funding them, all sorts of really leading things. And I think what Toronto shows is the fact we had a plan, and the follow-up plan was done 10 years later under the current mayor. And the research for that plan done by independent consultants showed that the City of Toronto's greenhouse gases emitted by the geographic area, not just by the city operations, are 33% below what they were in 1990. And that comes from the city plan and from the provincial government closing the Lakeview coal-fired plant, which supplied electricity to Toronto, particularly for air conditioning. So the Toronto experience shows that if you address these areas meaningfully, you have a good plan, the mayor takes leadership, you get business and civil society on board, you can make deep and meaningful cuts in carbon emissions.
But you are heading, I understand it, to COP26 in Glasgow at the end of the month. What's the message that you hope people will hear about how cities can fight climate change?
I think what people are going to first hear from Glasgow is worry about national governments not doing what they committed to in Paris 6 years ago, which is increasing their ambition. And I hope what they hear from cities, because our mayors will be in Glasgow saying it, is that there are actions being taken today that if we do more of them quickly in your city, despite what national governments aren't doing, we can actually get the world on the path it needs to be. There is real action. There's a reason for hope, but we need to work with our city governments and our mayors to help make those actions happen really quickly.
David Miller, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
My conversation with David Miller originally aired in October, just ahead of COP26.